living a life where you love big and you dream big and you epically fail and you try again. That's like how you live incredibly full, right? I think that I've always been the type that loves people in a big way and cares deeply about what I'm doing and has a lot of passion for things, to the point that sometimes it ends up being very heartbreaking. But I also think that if you want to live your best life, that's how you have to choose to live.
Welcome to For the Long Run, the podcast exploring the why behind what keeps runners running long, strong, and motivated. I'm your host, Jonathan Levitt. Through personal and professional connections in the running world, I have the privilege of getting to know some amazing athletes. I've always been fascinated by the psychological aspect of running, and this podcast is aimed at exploring this and much more. I hope you enjoy. Thank you to Tracksmith for their support of For the Long Run podcast. Tracksmith is a Boston-based running apparel brand born from a desire to celebrate both the history and the evolving culture of running. Tracksmith recently released their fall collection, which was designed to celebrate the seasonal shifts as we find our rhythm this fall. I have been loving their Van Cortlandt long sleeve, which pairs well with the Alston half tights on a brisk fall day. This episode is brought to you by Gooder. Summer is here and Gooder has the slickest shades around for only $25 and $35. They don't slip or bounce, and they stay on my face way better than more expensive sunglasses do. If you'd like to support me and the show, treat yourself to a pair or two or three of Gooders and head over to gooder.com and get 15% off your entire order with the code FTLR. That's 15% off at gooder.com, code FTLR. Your face will thank you. Welcome back. I am still in Boulder here with Jessica Broderick. Thanks so much for taking some time to chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. So the first question is always a tough one. Who is Jessica?
I remember we were messaging on Instagram about this because I posted something like, if you can't use your career or your accomplishments or things like that to describe who you are, what would you be? And I think that that's really challenging. I was doing like a bit of journaling when I saw that post. Who am I? Let's see. I'm a runner. I'm a family girl. I'm a very passionate friend. I'm a coach. Yeah. And I would say if I couldn't use any of those things, I would describe myself as joy.
Having run with you a bunch of times now, yes, that checks out. So you're part of Boulder Underground. I've had a handful of your teammates on the podcast as well. And the joy aspect is fortunately not unique to you within that team and even within this town, which is really cool to see. And I'm curious your thoughts on maybe why that is. And I've talked with Tansy a lot about this. Shout out to Tansy, who was episode like 150 or so back in March of this year. And our hypothesis is that people who are in places where they didn't grow up, where that's more common, there's like a different bond or a different connection amongst the people that are there. Curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I grew up in Connecticut and I went to school out here. And within months of arriving here for school, I was calling it home. And the way I would describe it is I love being on the East Coast with family. And I have a lot of memories, obviously, from growing up in that part of the country. But Boulder, for me, my baseline level of happiness is just so much higher. And I think once I realized that that was true, I've really made a point to get back here after my triathlon career and kind of land in a place where I know when I wake up in the morning, I'm already at like a 7 out of 10. So it doesn't make it hard to have a great day when you live in a place that you just experience so much joy at a baseline level. But yeah, I think it's kind of interesting to look at people who have chosen where they want to live based on those reasons and maybe not just settled where they've grown up or where their family is. I think there's something unique about I'm going to live in this place because it brings me a lot of happiness.
Yeah, I completely agree. My experience with Colorado was like every time I came here, I would leave like sad, feeling like I was leaving. I don't know, like I know a lot of people here and it feels like home, but like I know a lot of people in Boston too. Mm-hmm. And it's just like it's different. The baseline joy is something that I definitely resonate with. It's like you wake up every day and you see mountains, and some people don't care about mountains. And for others, like it's the ocean or it's a lake or whatever it is. But I think it's so important to like find what makes you happy and seek more of it.
I agree. And I think it's harder to do that than it seems. I think part of it is having the awareness of what it is that really brings you joy, and then taking action and making sure that you're building a life, whether it's choosing somewhere geographically that you're going to live or choosing a place where you can have, you know, the beautiful scenery and adventure we have here in Colorado, but also making sure to build a community around it. So I think for me, Colorado, I fell in love with it when I came here for school. And then over the years between triathlon and now running and the work I do, I've just been so blessed with the support and community I have. And I think that's taken it to a whole nother level of joy for me.
Very cool. Well, since the Colorado Board of Tourism hasn't yet officially sponsored this podcast, we can move on from ranting and raving about Colorado. If you're listening,
you should come here.
Yeah, you should reply to my emails. Let's talk about your triathlon career. So you've been a pro triathlete in your past. So let's talk about that journey. When did that become an idea for you?
So I never grew up wanting to be a professional athlete. I was always super active and involved in tons of sports. And my parents did a really good job of introducing us to all sorts of things. And in high school, I decided to start running the end of my sophomore year for track. And that was because my older sister, who is a year and a half older than me, kind of wanted to have something on her own. So she was playing tennis in the spring and she kind of nudged me away from it and said, "Hey, I think I'd love to have some time by myself," because we did everything together. And so I always say that she's like the reason why I fell in love with running. So I started running, but right around the same time I started doing triathlon. My mom competed in them locally and I thought, man, this sport is crazy, but I think I should try it. And I kind of started having success locally, and I was contacted by one of the USA Triathlon development coordinators to get involved with ITU racing. And it kind of just snowballed and my career just kind of took off, but I never really planned for it or really anticipated it would become what it did. And I actually talk about running now as being the sport that I think I always loved the most. I just happened to have success with triathlon and kind of saw it through. But I'm really happy to have landed back with running, even though it's not my career and I'm just doing it for fun. I think that it was what I always loved the most.
What was it like initially realizing that, wow, I'm actually pretty good at this?
Actually, when triathlon started to become my job, I think I started to lose the love for it. And I think that's why, come full circle and being a coach, I realized that as much as my professional athletic career taught me so much, I think that what I was meant to do is what I'm doing now. And maybe all the things I learned were like lessons that make me a better coach and make it really natural for me to lead athletes and prioritize mental health and happiness. But it was a cool feeling. I mean, when you're achieving things that you didn't think you could do and traveling the world and racing on the national team, it's really amazing. I just think for me personally, being a professional athlete was actually quite isolating. And as you know, I'm very social and extroverted and I love helping people. So there was always a component of my career where I felt I wasn't really fulfilling my deepest passions, which is definitely helping other people achieve their goals.
So at what point did you decide you needed to make a change?
So I had been racing full time for about 5 years and my career kind of took off and I was performing at a pretty high level relative to where I was at before in 2014 and 2015. But I think simultaneously, my mental health was unraveling. I just didn't really have the best training environment and coach for a period of that time. And while I was achieving a lot on a physical standpoint, I think that simultaneously I wasn't necessarily addressing some things that were going on with my psyche and my emotional and mental health. So I took a step back from the sport in 2017. And that's when I got involved with coaching. I started coaching at the high school I went to in Connecticut. I coached a team of 75 women, a swim team, and then I coached track and field. And I just felt more fulfilled than I ever did with anything else in my life. And eventually I went back to racing in 2018 because I thought, okay, I've worked on myself. I've gotten to a place where I'm happy and feel like I've invested in my happiness and self-love and all of the things that are important. So I decided to go back to racing. But once I did and I stopped coaching, I just wasn't happy again. So that's when I realized it was time to kind of move on. But I was grateful that I went back to racing in 2018 because I was able to retire happy and healthy. And that for me was a victory.
So you retired?
I was very tired.
So you retired?
Oh, I retired. I was also very tired.
Very tired retiree.
Yeah.
What happens the next day? How do you feel?
Well, the process of retiring from sport, and I'm sure you've talked to other professional athletes about this, it's not like an overnight thing. I had spent 5 or 6 years fully invested in being a full-time athlete. It was very tunnel visioned and trying to make an Olympic team and very focused. And so to move on from that, it wasn't just like, okay, I'm going to move on to being a coach now. It was really working on that transition to what was next. And I think that that's something a lot of people struggle with because they often don't know what's next. I was grateful that I had experience coaching and I kind of knew what was next. But for me, it was a matter of like moving away from having all of my support system help me with that career and moving away from sponsorships and like all those partnerships that develop over your career. I think that kind of transitioning away from all the little parts that make up your career was the hardest bit for me.
I've spoken with a handful of athletes who have made that move and they all say exactly the same thing. I had Caroline Burkle on the podcast who won an Olympic medal, I believe in London in swimming. And she said the worst period of her life was what happened after that. So she had medaled and then things fell apart. What she did from there was fascinating. She's now running an organization called Rise, and it's pairing youth athletes with Olympians and professional athletes and like giving them something to do and like some sort of purpose, either post competition or during. And she like raves about the experience that those athletes have, both the kids and the adults. But I think it's fascinating that like you train for so long for one thing and then you either do it or you don't. And then what? Like I had Gwen on the podcast sitting in that exact spot 2 weeks ago. And she was like, I trained my entire life for one thing and then it happened. Like that doesn't ever happen. And then it happened. And then what? And it's like, I think it's one thing to be able to have the drive and the devotion and the consistency to like give yourself the chance to be in that position where you compete at the biggest stage or you compete at a local stage, whatever. And that's your goal. And it's really interesting what happens next.
I agree. I think a lot of people have almost an identity crisis. I think what makes athletes at the top of their sports so great is that they're able to be so intentional and focused. And Gwen would always talk about her decisions in triathlon as investments, not sacrifices. And I agree entirely. You invest so much in what you're doing with this goal. And I never got to the level that Gwen was at, but I was, I approached my process in a similar way. And I think it's really hard to move on from that and take the things you've learned and apply them in the next arena. Like I said before, I was really grateful to have had the experience of feeling like I could be good at something else before I decided to ultimately retire. And I think that's a fear that a lot of people have, is that they're so great at something or that they're trying to be so great at something. They're scared that maybe they won't be great at something after that.
And you had that fear?
I did have that fear up until I started coaching during my year off of racing. And I think one of the reasons that it brought me so much joy is because I came to that realization of, oh my gosh, like
there are other things.
There are other things. And, you know, I worked with all of these high school girls going through a lot of challenging things. And I was the person they came to for advice, whether it was swimming, life, school. It felt really good to be that source of light and guidance for someone. And I think that process made me realize that I could be great at something else.
So you came back to Boulder?
I came back to Boulder.
And what year was that?
So I came out here on St. Patrick's Day in 2019. I drove across the country.
From Connecticut?
From Connecticut.
That's a haul.
Yes.
So you came back to Boulder 2019. Mm-hmm. What's the first thing you did?
I went to go see Jason, who's now my fiance. So he was living here and he's a professional triathlete. That's how we met. So I drove across the country, and I always tell him I didn't come here for him, but I went and saw him. So yeah, that was the first thing I did.
And let's talk about the community. First, what does community mean to you?
Community is everything. I think as much as I had incredible support during my athletic career as a triathlete, it felt different because I was often, you know, traveling, living out of a suitcase. The support felt different because it wasn't an everyday face-to-face type community support. And so when I moved back out here, one of my goals was, if I'm going to be involved in sport in the sense of having athletic goals, community is going to be at the core of it, because I just think that the joy and the success is magnified when you share it with people. So I went to Lululemon and I started my partnership with them. I eventually seeked out a running group with Boulder Underground where I'm still running. And it's just made the journey infinitely more enjoyable to have community around me.
Yeah, the vibe with Boulder Underground, I joked it should be called Boulder Funderground. It's like a rare dynamic where like everyone is so invested in everyone else. I want to talk about your Chicago experience, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
Do you want to give a little background on
my race?
Well,
or
let me we'll frame it a little differently. So you've been training for Chicago. Mm-hmm. That was a goal race.
Yeah, that was definitely a goal race.
So we talked a little bit after the race about how things went and where your mind went. And I'm really curious to dive further into that. So how are you feeling at the start line of Chicago?
So Chicago was the first marathon I had done, well, like most people, in like basically 2 years. And so there was a big buildup, and obviously not racing in 2020 was a bummer. And, you know, we were all so excited to just be at the start line again. And about a month before Chicago, I had raced a 10K and ran really well. I PR'd, or my altitude PR, by over a minute. So I was feeling really ready physically, not just from that race, but the whole buildup. I was just feeling really strong. But around the same time that I raced that 10K, we lost my cousin and her husband in a plane crash. And I always talk to my athletes about stress and how it's not physical stress from training or, you know, work stress. It's just all stress, right? It all contributes to your ability to push yourself and stay focused within a race. So leading up to the marathon, I was really sad, and part of me wanted to go out there and honor my cousin and her husband. I now have a tradition where I write their names on my bib when I race. So I knew I was going to race. I made that decision to honor them and get there. But I think the race itself kind of cracked me open. As you know, from your marathon experiences, marathon really strips you raw, and it's really a tough day, even on the days that it really goes well. It's just kind of it's like staring at your soul. So when I was on the start line, I was kind of calm, but also emotional. You know, I had tears running down my face, and it was just a lot. And I think we can do hard things. Like I always say that to my friends, and they say it to me. And I had the belief that I could get through it. I just wasn't sure what it was going to be like. Yeah.
So the miles start ticking off and you're running with a friend.
Mm-hmm.
who was planning on pacing you for halfway, 16 miles?
Yeah, 13 to 16 was the plan. Yeah, my friend Brianna Bomer, she joined Boulder Underground. I don't know how many months ago it was, but she's relatively new to the group. Amazing person, amazing runner. She had an Achilles injury, and so her original plan was to run Chicago, to race it. And her husband was racing, and they had a whole trip planned. So she's like, hey, how would you feel about me pacing you for this race? And I was like, oh my God, I would love that. Of course. So her plan was to run about 16 miles with me. But around 14 or 15, I started to kind of go through a rough patch. And you know how marathon is. Sometimes you just kind of dip and then the gel brings you back to life and you're fine. I never really came back around. And I think maybe it was a combination of the heat. Maybe it was the weight and the heaviness of things I had been going through with my family. We never really know. There's always tons of variables that contribute to hard days, but she decided to stay with me. So she stayed with me through 14, 15, 16, as things started to turn. At 21, I was walking and crying. She stayed with me then, and she got me to the finish line. So the day was not what I imagined, but in a lot of ways, it was more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. And I think that sometimes we can inspire by getting to the finish, even if it's a bad day. We can find like so much strength in the days that are that hard, where we're like, oh my God, I can't believe I just got to the finish line. So I learned a lot. Definitely wasn't what I wanted. I know that I can run a faster marathon, but I think it taught me that I'm really strong. And I know that there'll be a better marathon down the road.
Yeah, I love a lot of things about that. So I ran Boston in 2017. I ran an hour over goal time, and I was like trashed for weeks from it. And I wouldn't trade that experience for the world, right? It's like I ran 4:01 and I was shooting for sub 3.
Yeah.
And the like delta between where I finished and where I was expecting and how hard that was massive. And I think these are the experiences that, like, as you said, like strip you raw and pummel you. Like marathons are fun.
Yeah.
But it, like, wouldn't trade it for the world.
No, I think sometimes the universe gives us things that we need, but maybe we don't want. Like I didn't want to walk at mile 21, and I didn't want to slow down, and I didn't want to struggle the way that I did. But there were things that I learned from continuing to move forward. And I think I certainly struggled the last month since Chicago with not having the day that I dreamt of having and that I know I can have. But I've really tried to focus on having the perspective of what can I learn from that day? What did that day maybe help others learn? Did it inspire other people? And I think finishing races is a big deal. You know, I think it matters if we choose to keep moving forward in the midst of hell or like a day that's just really hard. And so I'm really proud of it. Like I think that the more I think about it, the more proud I am.
What were those big lessons or big takeaways?
We can do hard things.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the biggest one. I am 99% sure I will never have a day that was that hard. And no one really knows, right? Like Bree might be the closest to knowing how hard that day was for me because she was there for every moment of it. But when we get through things like that, I just think we learn so much about ourselves. And so for me, we can do really, really hard things. And also we can choose to be strong in the face of adversity, right? Like we can choose to continue to move forward, even though things aren't going well. We can choose to honor people that are no longer here through the things that we do that give us so much strength. And so I think I just saw that races don't necessarily have a lot of profound meaning simply because they're fast or because they're a PR. In fact, I think a lot of times I've been most inspired by what people can do on the heels of times that are very challenging.
Yeah, I love that. I think that there's so much to be said for like using running as a sandbox for learning in life, right? Like at the end of the day, like you start a marathon, like there are not that many bad things that can happen between the starting line and the finish line. Like most people will survive that process, but the things that happen in between inform what we do in places where like the magnitude of failure is much more substantial, right?
Mm-hmm.
If we screw up in a relationship, if we screw up with kids, if we screw up at work, things like that, like the ramifications are a little more challenging, which isn't to say you shouldn't take risks or you shouldn't put yourself out there. I'm saying it's a lot easier to test those waters in a no stakes, lower stakes environment.
Totally. And I think so much of what we do when we race is an extension of who we are every day. And I think it's important that we're consistent with that. You know, I went through a period of time in my triathlon career where I dropped out of some races because I was having a really bad day and I didn't want to have a bad result with my name because I was very insecure and I thought that people care. Like people don't care, you know, and the people that matter really don't care, right? Like the people that love you, they just want to see you happy and they want to see you doing things that bring you joy and that give you life. And I think if you look at the photos, that's been a really therapeutic process for me and kind of like unraveling the day of Chicago. If you look at the photos at the finish line, like the joy that I felt just getting there with Bree, like you can see it in the photos. And I remember feeling like the most excruciating pain ever. And it switched to some of the most like proud, joyful feelings I've ever had within seconds, right? So I think sometimes when things aren't going the way we plan, you just have to remember that the finish line can still be magical, right? And I think in a marathon, even more so.
Thank you again to Tracksmith for their support of the podcast. I've been a fan of Tracksmith and their community-first efforts ever since my early days of running in Boston. As my miles increase again ahead of some big goals this coming spring, I'm definitely doing it in comfort and style with their gear. I'm also proud to partner with Tracksmith because they're going to donate 5% of your order value to the Michael J. Fox Foundation for all orders, and you'll also get free shipping. The Michael J. Fox Foundation is dedicated to finding a cure and helping those living with Parkinson's. Both of my grandfathers have or had Parkinson's, and I'm grateful of Tracksmith's support for something so personal. Visit tracksmith.com/forthelongrun to see some of my favorite pieces, and all orders that start from that page will contribute towards this donation. Thanks again to Gooder for supporting this episode. I have a few different styles of shades, and I've been loving them on runs or while at the pool. At $25 a pop, you can leave a pair in your car so that you'll never be without some shades. You can feel good about your purchase too, as 1% of Gooder's annual gross sales, not profits, go directly to environmental nonprofits working towards making our world a better place. If you'd like to support me in the show, treat yourself to a pair or two or three of Gooders and head over to gooder.com and get 15% off your entire order. That's 15% off at goodr.com with the code FTLR. Your face will thank you. Those photos were incredible. Seeing the two of you just locked in stride for stride.
Yeah.
Knowing some part of what that journey felt like is incredible. The piece about nobody cares is fascinating, right? I had a conversation with Scott Fauble on the podcast and he was like, oh yeah, if I have a bad day, like, is my girlfriend going to hate me? No. The example that I share over and over, and I've shared it over and over on this podcast, is after I ran rim to rim to rim in the Grand Canyon, which is like the hardest thing I've ever done and maybe will ever do. I sat down on the bus to go back to the campsite and I opened up a picky bar. And every time I tell the story, I highlight the fact that it's a picky bar because if you've eaten a picky bar, you know how crinkly the wrappers are. So I start opening this crinkly wrapper and the bus driver turns around and goes, no eating on the bus. And I go, ma'am, I just, did rim to rim to rim. I'm really hungry. She goes, no eating on the bus. And here I am, like, again, raw, having just accomplished the best thing I've ever, or the most challenging thing I've ever done. And I tell this woman, trying to use it as justification to let me eat this stupid little snack bar. She's like, I don't care. The world goes on. Nobody cares. Like the biggest thing I'd ever done. I don't care. No eating on the bus. And it's just the perfect epitome of like, we do this for ourselves and for the stories and journey and process that allows us to pursue. I was just talking with a friend who's going to run 100 miles in June. And in thinking about this, it's like, she is so damn excited to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning, line up at 5 o'clock and go uphill for 5 miles and then go downhill for 95 miles. And I'm like, this is optional. You choose to do this. Yeah. And many of the people around her will puke and not finish and all these things. And we choose challenging things. We choose to get uncomfortable because why do you think we do it?
I think that oftentimes when we're pushing ourselves to our limits, we learn the most about ourselves. So, and I think that there's a shared misery in that. I don't know. It's interesting. Runners in particular, the runners that I've met in this community, there's like this shared passion for
struggle.
Yeah, for struggle. But I think it's great because we don't learn anything from stuff that's easy. Like, when have you ever met a person who's interesting that's like, my life has been really great. I haven't had any challenges. And here I am. It's like, okay, well, that's awesome. But like, people aren't interesting who are like that. The interesting people are the ones that take risks and fail and go through trial and error and keep getting back up. And they eventually figure it out because they've made the decision all those times that they've failed to keep going. And those are the kind of people that I find a lot of runners are like that. And I think that those people are fascinating. And I love spending time with them because they're relatable and they're real. And the world needs more of that.
Totally. I think that it's, as you're saying, it's like, it's boring to live like an easy and not challenging life. We talk all the time at work about like, so I'm in sales and the goalposts are always moving. And it's like, well, what have you done lately? What are you doing next week? What are you doing next quarter? And it's just like, it's stressful, but it would be horribly boring and wouldn't feel fun, or we wouldn't feel any sort of accomplishment if it was just like, all right, another day. Like, just clock in, clock out, boring.
Right. I have talked to a lot of my friends about this, and I used to think that the way that I live my life was almost setting me up for heartbreak. But the way that I think about it now is that living a life where you love big and you dream big and you epically fail and you try again, that's like how you live incredibly full, right? I think that I've always been the type that loves people in a big way and cares deeply about what I'm doing and has a lot of passion for things, to the point that sometimes it ends up being very heartbreaking. But I also think that if you want to live your best life, that's how you have to choose to live. And so it's kind of interesting because a lot of people, I think, find that safe spot where they're comfortable. And there's nothing wrong with living like that, right? Like a job that's very stable and like
predictable.
Yeah, things that are comfortable. But I think that like the best life you can live is one that requires that you take risks and that you challenge yourself to like give more, love more, be more. And I am super committed to that way of living, even if it means that I fail epically and I have days like Chicago and things like that. Cause I just think that you learn and then you just love and live more.
I love that. And I live that.
Yes.
I was talking with Kara Goucher about this exact topic after some race I did. And I forget which race it was, but she was like, show me an athlete who rides the razor's edge. I'll show you an athlete who gets cut a lot, but has epic breakthroughs. And again, there's a parallel between running and life there. Like, you can't have the epic breakthroughs in running without riding that edge and without screwing up and failing and learning from it and pivoting. Same thing in life. Like, again, a lot of people listening are probably like, this sounds horrible. Like, I have no interest in living a life that she's talking about or he's talking about. And that's fine, right? And they probably can't imagine what we're talking about. I can't imagine that. But I think it's so interesting that there are so many people who, as you said, live and try, and it's like trying to, like, how far can you go, right? I forget where I was going with this, but the point is, it seems to be for some people and really not for others. But I think that it's like training, right? If you stay consistent and you stay conservative, you might progress over the years, and running will be good and not great, and you'll be fine. Whereas if you challenge the way you think about it and push the limits and push the boundaries and probably do too much at some point, you'll find your potential, but you'll also come up very short in some places. And this is how I sort of contextualized or like dealt with my first big injury a couple of years ago. I had bilateral stress reaction in my tibias.
Oh my goodness. How'd that feel?
It actually didn't feel bad. But we caught it before it became a problem. My chiropractor, Brian Kent, was like pushing on my post tib, and I was screaming. He's like, that shouldn't be happening. So anyway, long story short, went in for x-rays and MRIs and took 6 weeks off of running. And at first I was really frustrated. I was like, what the hell? Like, I have all these resources around me. I could do blood work. I knew I was eating enough. My vitamin D was fine. I thought I was stress-free enough. I work with a coach. And I was like, how is this possible? And the point that David, my coach, made was like, this is the point. Like, this is a data point. We found your threshold. We exceeded it. And then we pivoted, and we'll pivot in the future. And we know where too far for your body is right now. And I think that's the point, right? Like, you can't find out how far you can go unless you figure out what's too far every so often.
Totally. I think life is about constantly pushing to see what those limitations are. And a lot of people are scared to do that. I mean, I'm scared to do that. But I think another Glennon Doyle quote for you, like, I think it's something along the lines of, you can be scared and afraid and nervous and all the things, but you can show up anyways, right? So I think finding those limitations often means you're going to have pain and probably failure, quote unquote. But really, it's not failure, because you're going to learn from it if you choose to. I think that the lesson there is, like, if you're going to commit to pushing your limits to find like where they really are, you have to also commit to the fact that you're going to have days that are really bad, or days where you swing and you miss, and that's okay, right? But I think, like I said before, our best lives are when we're really pushing our limits to figure out the best version of who we can be as a human, as a runner, as a whatever you are in your career, as a partner, as a friend, all of the things. So I think that that's the best way to live. Totally.
To your point on swinging and missing, you can be a pretty good baseball player if you fail 70% of the time.
You can be.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the last few weeks and months and years. Fast forward 5 years from today, what are you really proud of? You haven't done it yet, but you will.
I'm proud of the people that I have in my life. I think that the relationships that we have and our community are a result of how much we give. And I'm proud of the people that I have in my life, because I've worked really hard on becoming my best self so that I can be my best self for other people. And it's an ongoing process that I'm committed to until I die, because I think that's how you create your best life. I think people are everything. We're here for each other, right? Like, at the end of the day, we're really here for each other. And as soon as I learned that, I realized that I wanted to be better for everyone in my life. And the only way that I could do that was to work on myself. So I think what I'll be most proud of is my community and family, both blood and non-blood, and all the things we share.
August 2019, I'm sitting down with my grandfather for the last time. We both knew it would be the last time we'd ever see each other. And he was basically saying goodbye. And in this conversation, he was dying of Parkinson's. In this conversation, he tells me, he's like, the whole meaning of why we're here is to leave the world a better place than when we entered it. He's like, I'm really proud of how the family is and what I've done on this earth. And I can be confident that when I go, your grandma will be okay and your mom will be okay and you'll be okay and this and that. And so hearing you say it the way that you just shared it is exactly how this man who's 80 plus years old and has seen some things in his life, that was his take on why are we here? Mm-hmm. And he said at the end of the day, like, he's proud and he's happy with what he's done and he was at peace.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of us fear that place where we know it's over or whatever. And I can't begin to comprehend that mental state, mm-hmm. but I can absolutely resonate with the why and what you shared and what he shared. And I think that it's really powerful to like be in a place where you understand that kind of thing. And like, that's what matters. That's the only thing that matters. I find it so fascinating to ask this question because when I first started asking it, I was expecting most answers to be like winning this or running that time or blah, blah, blah. And I'd say the majority of time people answer with something subjective mm-hmm. and something that they control, more importantly.
Yeah.
Like you can control everything that you just said mm-hmm. about what you determined to be success in the next 5 years.
Yeah.
Which means you'll do it and you'll achieve it.
Yeah.
Because you're driving versus like, oh, I want to win Olympic gold. Like you have no control over any of that.
Right.
And so I started asking this question and I kept noticing that high level athletes were saying very subjective things to something that I thought would be an objective, quantitative thing. And it's fascinating that that's not the case.
It is really interesting. And I think for a number of years, I would have said something very different, like when I was a triathlete and before I spent a lot of time working on myself and kind of understanding why we're here and what life is really about. And I do have things I want to achieve, like concrete things, like running under 240 in a marathon. I just put it out there into the world. Things like that, right? Or getting married next year, having a family, all these things that are more like concrete in the sense you can say them and they're life events or things that are going to happen. But if you think about what's at the core of all those things, it's people, right? Like people that you love and people that are important to you, that you give yourself to over and over again. And the importance of those relationships. Like I always say to my friends and my athletes and everyone, the finish lines mean nothing if you don't have anyone to share them with, right? So I think, like, of course, I'm associating that metaphor to running, but that's the case with everything in life. If you can sit and realize that you're committed to being your best self, and that in turn is creating a group of people that you love and care for that invest in you, that's what life's about. And there is nothing better than that.
Totally agree. So let's say someone's listening and they're like, wow, I'm really results driven. And I'd love to like figure out how to approach things like she's talking about. What's step 1 and 2?
I think the outcome goals, and I talk to my athletes about this all the time, they're important, right? They're out on the horizon. They're important to put out there. Like I just said, I want to run under 240 in a marathon. And that's something where you write it down or you say it out loud and it becomes real. But it's out on the horizon and all the steps that have to be taken to get there, you have to focus on what's under your feet, right? And I think that in pursuing something down the road that's scary or big, if you are results driven, you can get so narrow-minded and focused on that one thing that you forget to enjoy the journey. And I think Tansy talked about this in her podcast, like holding the egg, right? A lot of people will just squeeze the shit out of that sucker. And I think that oftentimes in the process of doing that, you lose sight of what's really important. So, I mean, if you were to go and run your dream time in a marathon, but the whole process of getting there was by yourself, isolated runs in the morning, no joy. Would it mean anything to you? Maybe. but it's going to mean 100 times more to share it with people, to have joy and happiness at the core of your experience. So I think looking at the things that are important in your life and prioritizing those things in your process and realizing that those things actually need to be there in order for you to get the most out of yourself or like reach your limits.
Very cool. So sort of backtracking now, what does the 240 mean?
Sub 240, I have to blame Erin Osgood for that. And the reason being, and I told her this before Chicago, when she joined Boulder Underground this year, I kind of had it in my mind, like, I'd love to OTQ in the marathon when I can figure it out one day, because I've only run 3 of them now. And we were talking about times, and this was very early on in our friendship. And she's now one of my closest friends. She'll be in my wedding. But early on, she said that she wanted to run under 240. And I thought, shit, I want to run under 240. So she kind of like made me level up. You know, I had originally thought, like I'll run under 245 or something like that. So she kind of made me realize that maybe I needed to dream bigger. And she, amongst all of my closest friends, hold me accountable to dreaming bigger and trying to be better in every way. And so that's kind of where that came from.
I love it. So it's not about a time, it's about dreaming bigger. And that time is a metaphor for dreaming bigger.
Yeah, like I said, you know, we all have goals that maybe have a time with them in our heads. But I always think of that as a very much a secondary thing. And I remember when Nicole interviewed me before Chicago, or she asked me to just give her a quote for a Chicago preview for Instagram. I said that. I was like, running fast is really secondary in the way that I think about my running journey and what I want to achieve. I want to go run with my friends and have fun. And if I happen to run fast in the process of doing that, then that's like the cherry on top for me at this point.
I love that. It's been such an interesting experience running with all of you because, first of all, it's like very intelligent. I run like an idiot, particularly long runs. And so the first long run that I joined, we went out at like 8:30 pace. And I was like, y'all are like 2:45 marathoners. What's going on here? And so I found it such an experience to like finish long runs feeling so good and feeling so strong and going fast. And so like I'm finally understanding the right way to insert speed and paces into the process, which is feel good running fast. Like that feels so good. Who cares what fast is as a number? More of as an effort. And I'd not previously figured out how to run fast while also running long until you just start really slow and then ease into it. And then like all of a sudden we're 10 miles in and we're rolling fast. So that part has been an experience, but the joy amongst the group, and like even this morning, like running around watching Courtney run a workout on the toilet bowl. Like even the names of the routes are fun. So I think there are a lot of takeaways in that. It's that it really is so much about the people around you, and the same run solo versus with other people, like it makes such a difference. I mean, this is not rocket science. This is like fairly obvious, but I don't know. I think there's so much to finding joy in the process and more importantly, running with other people who have found joy in the process.
Totally. And I think we have a lot of people like that with our group. Our coach prioritizes that as well. I think that he cares about our development as runners, and he's a phenomenal coach, and he's helping us all in our individual journeys. But I think he also really emphasizes the importance of us all supporting each other, and how maybe that's something that is even more important than the physical training, the component of community and team and having each other's backs and supporting each other through highs and lows. And I think oftentimes running, the training is like the easy part. I think that all of us have things that happen in our lives that are harder to manage. And so I think running brought us together, but I think that the shared experiences of life struggle, family struggle, loss, grief, these things, I think that we all feel like we have people behind us. And I think that that's even more powerful than having someone who's pacing you or someone who can run the intervals with you every single day.
Totally. I think it's a good place to wrap for today. So if people want to find you and your running joy on Instagram, where can we find you?
My Instagram handle is Jess E. Broderick. A lot of people call me Jessie, but it's actually Jess E, and E is my middle initial for Aaron Broderick.
Got it. Yeah. I will stop making that mistake then.
You haven't called me Jessie.
Not to you.
No. Oh, okay. Well, you can call me Jessie if you want. But yeah. And then I work at Revo PT here in town. I'm a strength coach there. And then I coach runners and triathletes and cyclists through Forever Endurance. So that's a company that's based here in Boulder as well.
Very cool. Thanks so much for taking some time to chat, and we'll see you out there.
Thank you. Bye.
That's it for today's episode. Like many long runs, it's sad when it has to end. I hope you join in next time on For the Long Run, and in the meantime, happy trails. If you enjoyed this episode, it would mean a lot to me if you shared it so that others can find it and enjoy it too. This podcast and the accompanying music has been produced by Brian Walters of Single Track Sound. For the Long Run's logo was created by Vanessa Wolf of Sterling Wolf.